First United Methodist Church of Sterling, Kansas. I welcome you to our next lesson in our James study, The Wisdom of Wholeness. I find this lesson to be at once the least naturally compatible with American culture, and at the same time extremely timely given the coronavirus pandemic. So I hope that this generates some good discussion when we gather together on Sunday morning to discuss it. Or if you're unable to join the Zoom call on Sunday morning for Sunday school, I do pray that it gives you some good reflection that you can do in your own household or for yourself. But what we're talking about this week, we've already hit most of our lessons for the summer, and so we're coming towards the end here, the third to last lesson, but we'll be looking at James 4:13 through 17, and the main topic, I think, of that section is self-determination and what it means to determine our own lives and whether that's good or not. And then we're also going to, as sort of the background issue for this week, talk about the date of the letter. When was James written? So we'll start with the second of those after we recap from last week. So last week we had a larger section, James 3:13, all the way into chapter 4, verse 12, and it commends true wisdom as producing wholeness. It produces wholeness in the community and also in the self. So to be sort of an integral whole self and not just divided and busy and stressed and pulled in many different directions. True wisdom is what kind of brings that kind of unity to self that you want and are looking for. And I think this is the theological heart of James, this exclusive commitment to God over the world. Because as soon as we love many things and we don't simply love God, we're pulled in lots of different directions, and we might be pulled between a desire to serve God and a desire to make money, or we might be pulled between a desire to serve God, but then also have status or be popular or live in a certain area, or whatever it may be. We're always kind of pulled in different directions, and this is even possible that with other people, as wonderful and important as other people are, we could be pulled towards loving other people over God would be another risk as well. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher following James, says purity of heart is to will one thing. To desire God alone is what it means to be pure in heart. So I think this is the heart of James. Now, as I talked about last week, I think it doesn't mean we can't love anything in the world in any sense. We love creation, we love other people, we love culture, in proper ways. But I think we always want to love those things through God and remember God is the creator of those things. And I think that's what protects our love and enjoyment of other people, of culture and creation in the right way is just loving them through God and remembering everything is a creation of God. Everything that is good is the creation of God. The other thing we talked about last week is the genre, that it's a general letter and wisdom literature. Maybe some more specific genre elements too, but those two are clear. And as a general letter, the important thing here is that it's not written to any one church, so we can't figure out a specific situation motivating part of the letter, but instead the sorts of things written here apply to all first century Christian Jews. And obviously, even more so, they apply to all Christians everywhere, including to our own day. But the audience does seem to have been, in the first instance, Christian Jews in the first century. As wisdom literature, one of the things we don't want to do is press the letter too much for developed ideas and continuity, because wisdom literature allows for kind of little breaks and just unique small ideas. So James is not developing a logic from chapter 1 to chapter 5. There's just lots of different reminders, and some of them are relatively independent of their context. And that's just fine because it is wisdom literature. So that's what we talked about with last week. Going to this week, we're going to tackle the background issue of the date of James first, and then talk about the content of the end of chapter 4. So this is one of the places where if you read a bunch of commentaries, which most of you do not do, I'm sure, but you might have a study Bible that gives you a little introduction to James or something. But there are commentaries out there and scholars out there who will date James anywhere from the first book of the New Testament written in the late 40s, maybe 47, 48 or something like that, all the way to the 160s to be really one of the last, if not the last book of the New Testament written. There's really no other New Testament book, I don't think, that has this wide of a divergence in terms of its date. And the reason for this is pretty simple. The letter, being a general letter written to lots of different people, it doesn't tell us much about itself. Even another similar letter just before this, Hebrews, doesn't give us a lot of information, but fortunately at the very end of Hebrews, we get a little bit of particular information. We know that the author is writing or is somehow connected to Italy, either writing from Italy or to Italy, and we hear about Timothy, which is probably the Timothy associated with Paul. And Hebrews also, by how it's written, and it seems to assume a standing temple, which kind of helps to say, well, this is probably before the year 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. So there are a number of things, even in Hebrews, which is a general letter, kind of doesn't give a lot of background, that still help us kind of date it. Paul's letters are even far more specific, and with the writing to Corinth or Rome, he tells us a lot of his plans, so we can do a lot to date Paul's letters for the most part. James is just different from either of those. There's just not a lot to help us within the letter itself that would kind of give us any sort of historical circumstances that we can say, oh, okay, this presupposes that this event has already taken place or that this event has not yet happened. We just don't really have that with James. So how do we try to figure out when this letter was written? The first and most important one is, who do you think the author is? And we've already talked about this in an earlier session this summer, but this is the kind of basic implication. So if it were by James the disciple, so in the Gospels we read of this trio of disciples who are closest to Jesus, Peter, James, and John, James and John being brothers. If it's by that James, then it would have to be before the year AD 44. Acts records his death under a Jewish Roman king by the name of King Agrippa I, and he was only reigning through 44. So at very latest, James dies in 44, and therefore this letter, if by him, would have to be written before the year 44. That would make it easily the earliest document in the New Testament, and for a variety of reasons, that seems unlikely. The most likely idea is that it's by James the Just, brother of Jesus. And he dies in 62. And we have there's a variety of accounts of his death after the New Testament writings, but the most secure and earliest and most accurate, almost certainly, is by the Jewish historian Josephus, who we can really date this very precisely because he records that there's a change of governors of Rome, Roman governors within Judea, between Festus, who we read about in Acts, and Albinus, who's the next Roman governor. And there's a short period of time when there's no governor in Judea, and the high priest at the time, Ananus, uses this period to convene a tribunal and to have James arrested on false charges and have him stoned to death. And this seems like there's no reason to think this isn't historical kind of memory and everything, and so we can date it quite precisely to the year 62. So if this is by James the Just, obviously it has to be written before he died, so it would have to be before 62. However, other people think it's just some other James, either in the New Testament or otherwise unknown, or just an unknown author in general, in which case, and that is possible, then we don't really have much to go on. It could be almost any time in the 1st or 2nd century, if that were the case. So the first factor that's most important is the author. The second factor, though, is the relationship to Paul. We mentioned this when we were talking about James 2:14 through 26, that it at least sounds like it has knowledge of Paul, and so we talked about the possibility there. But here it's kind of helpful to know sort of when James and Paul would have met each other, to kind of reconstruct that, because if James does indicate knowledge of Paul, then we can help sort of date the letter on that ground. So the first time they met was probably in the year 37. You coordinate some things that Paul says in Galatians 1 and 2 with what's recorded about Paul in Acts and some other kind of events that we know about, and it seems that the first time that Paul visited Jerusalem was probably around the year 37, and he says specifically in Galatians that on his first visit he met not only Peter but also James, the brother of Jesus. And so they would have first met in 37, but at that point Paul hadn't probably thought through his theology with nearly the depth that he had when he starts writing letters in the 40s and 50s and later. So it's not clear if he would have really had all of his ideas developed yet at 37 or not. The other kind of major date, there might be another meeting between these two events, but the other major one is what's called the Jerusalem Council in the year 49. This is recorded in Acts 15, but this is when all the early Christians, including Paul, Peter, and James, get together and sort of hammer out whether circumcision is necessary for those who are not Jewish entering the Christian faith and Christian community, and they decide, no, it's not necessary. And by that point, it's pretty clear that Paul would have had a developed theology and probably had his ideas pretty firm by that point. So this kind of implies a few things. If James is written independently of Paul, even though it sounds like Paul, if James doesn't actually know Paul, because by the Jerusalem Council, Paul probably had his message pretty well hammered out and would have been pretty well known, it would mean James would have to be written before the year 49, because otherwise James would certainly know Paul. You could argue that if you think Paul has his ideas developed by 37, then it would have to be written before 37, but there's at least some allowance that Paul was still kind of figuring out his terminology and his message and his theological understanding of salvation in Christ at that point. So if James is written independently of Paul, it has to be early. If it knows Paul, then it has to be obviously at least past 37, but most people think it knows Paul's developed theology would place it after 49. And a few people even think it knows specifically the book of Romans, which was written somewhere in 55, 57, 58, somewhere around there, in which case James would have to be after the mid-50s when Romans is written. So we have at least some places to kind of work on here. A third factor is other possible literary relationships. There are a number of suggestive hints of either James using, some people think Matthew, but certainly know some of Jesus' teaching. But on the other hand, there are some people who seem to use James, but it's hard to be definitive. So until about the year 200, there's no definitive clear source that either James uses or is used by James. I think there's some evidence of a writing that's probably before the year 70 that uses James, and even more so a writing from about 95 that seems to use James. So I tend to think it has to be relatively early, but those are debatable. So here overall are the three major perspectives that people have about the date. A number of people say this is by James the Just, and it's written independently of Paul, and therefore dated to the late 40s, making it one of the earliest writings in the New Testament, somewhere around the same time as Galatians or 1 Thessalonians, which would be the other competition for earliest writing in the New Testament. Others who think it is by James the Just, but he knows Paul's theology and is correcting Paul or misunderstanding of Paul, and that's my view, is that this is written at a time when James knows Paul's thoughts, but he's correcting a misunderstanding of Paul's thoughts in James 2. In which case you would have to say it's probably in the 50s or early 60s that this is written. So this would be my own perspective. I think James is early, but not quite that early. So more like the same time that Paul's writing most of his letters, maybe even closer to the year 60 or so. If it's by an unknown James or an unknown author, then obviously it could be any time, but most people who take this perspective will date it later, into the 2nd century, even in some cases. But for my part, I think either the first two are good options, and I tend to lead towards the second, that it was probably written in the 50s or around maybe 60 or so when it's written. So that's the background issue, but let's talk now about the actual content of James. And this is a short little paragraph, a shortest section we'll go through together in James, but we just have a few verses about boasting, and the audience here probably is traveling merchants or tradespeople. They talk about going to a city and making money. That sounds like in the ancient world, traveling merchants and tradespeople, and James thinks this is sinful. Their boast is sinful. Their plans are sinful. So I say they're business plans, but I put it in quotation marks because ancient business is not quite the same as modern business. And so there are overlaps in applications, but there weren't business people in the same way there are today exactly then. And then I'm skipping verse 14 for the moment, but in verse 15, James tells us his preferred phrasing. And I think we have a good idea of what James finds as a problem by seeing what he says they should do instead. So let's look at these two verses. What the tradespeople, the merchants, are saying is this: today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. That's their claim. That sounds like a very American sort of thing to do. You lay out your business plans, you have a model for the next 3 years, I'm going to do this. You can hear like a small business owner, here's my kind of benchmarks, here's my kind of plans, I'm going to establish it here, and you do all this planning and work. And in American business world, we usually think of this as a very good thing, at least up to a point. And so the question is, well, what's wrong with this? We know James thinks this is wrong. What's the problem that's at the heart of it? I think we can help understand what the problem is by looking at what James said you should say instead. He says, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. So clearly the most important thing in James's mind that they were doing wrong is they think they are determining their own lives, that they are autonomous, that they have the power and ability to decide their own fate in the future. And again, I think that's a very American trait. I think that's what we all default to, and maybe every culture does that to some degree, but I do think that's a particularly American sort of thing, is to assume we control our own fate and we make our own way in the world. We pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, we work hard, and we determine our future. And James says, no, you do not. You have to start every plan with, if it is the Lord's will, meaning either God's will or perhaps specifically Jesus's will. Obviously, there's not a huge difference there, but if it's God's will, if it's Jesus's will, then I'm going to do that. So this is the biggest thing. You are not autonomous. You do not have control of your fate. God has that control, and therefore we should always keep that in mind when we make plans. Some people also would say their claim is that they really want to make money and carry on business, and when James rephrases it, he just kind of talks about living and doing this or that. Maybe not. Maybe the second statement is just sort of general. But there's at least a chance that the desire to make money is itself a problem in James's mind, but that's not entirely clear. What is clear is we have to depend on God for our plans. So this is what we learn. And verse 16 gives the specific charge that it is arrogance and boasting to make your own plans and to not think about God when you are making those plans. So I think the problem, again, is primarily about self-determination or autonomy. We are not free in that sense of God. We are not free of fate. We do not control our own destiny. God controls our destiny, and we need to think about that and remind ourselves about that. Possibly because James is concerned about, we'll see even next week, the rich and the corrupting power that wealth can have, at least. Possibly that focus on making money is also a problem, but I wouldn't bank too much on that. I don't think that's entirely clear, at least. The reason James gives, and here we'll cycle back to verse 14, is he says, we do not control even tomorrow. Obviously, the implication is that God controls tomorrow. We do not. And this is where I think it's entirely timely. How many people had plans for what was going to happen in March, April, May? We have all these plans, and even today here in the summer, all of our plans, who knows what this will look like in September or November or January of 2021. We don't really know. All of our plans, so many things have been canceled and changed. Weddings, conferences, travel, business, so much has been changed. I think this is an extremely timely reminder that God oversees history and we do not. And all of our plans are necessarily tentative. So I think this is where James 4 is really timely for us. He also says in this verse, not only that God knows tomorrow and we do not, but he says that our life is short-lived. We are mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Obviously, the contrast here is that God is eternal and we are short-lived. But this is also something that is entirely not the American way of thinking. We don't think about death very often. We focus on the young and beautiful and the healthy, and we love sports, all these sorts of things that remind us of youth and strength and virility. And James says, no, we have to remember death. Death comes to us all. And again, the coronavirus is reminding us of that very painful and yet true reality. And so James commends remembering God's sovereignty and that God is in control and we are not, but also that we're short-lived and that we have to keep that in mind when we make our plans. There's no guarantee that any of us will be around next week, and we have to live our lives in light of that. Now, obviously, there's an eternal hope that we have as Christians, and James, certainly believes that, but that's not his point here. His point here is that we have to live tentatively when we think about our earthly lives, because there's very little we control, far less than we would like to imagine. And then at the very end of this unit, there's this final maxim or saying that might be in a totally independent unit. Again, sometimes some of James sort of fits, but not totally clearly, so I could see how this develops logic that's already happened, but it could be its own sentence. It says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. This could kind of fit in terms of we know we should say if it is the Lord's will, we should do this or that or something, but could build off of what's been said, but it could sort of stand alone. But in any case, the point is that it shifts morality to active doing and not just passive avoiding. Sometimes we think of sin as something we do, and therefore as long as we don't do much, we're not sinning. But the point instead is that morality is a more active thing, and we have to be good people, and we have to be out there doing good in the world. And if you sit back and do nothing, you're not avoiding sin, but you might actually be doing sin by doing nothing. And so it kind of shifts our understanding of what morality is, which I think is also an important and interesting point that James makes here. And a very tough teaching is the truth of it as well. So that's how James rounds out this section. So some takeaways and questions on this. The first is, we are not masters of our own lives. The Lord is, and we should remember that, and we should take that seriously when we make our plans. Second, and this is not directly what James says, but I think is an implication or an inference we can draw from James. If it's the case that we are not autonomously creating everything and that our success is not from our own hands, but instead comes from God, then I think it shifts our understanding of everything that we do have that's good in our lives away from thinking of it as something we've earned to something that has been given to us as a gift from God. And I hope that kind of actually makes it better, that we don't look at our house or family or status or success or wealth or anything as like, oh, I achieved this, I deserve this, but instead, wow, what good has God done to me? I think it provides more gratitude and enjoyment in life. So not directly stated from James, but I think we can infer that from how he shifts our understanding. A couple questions that we'll consider on Sunday. What kind of plans is it arrogant to make? So what kind of plans can we make that are good? And when is it proper to make plans? And how can we more generally live this teaching in the modern world? Because we make retirement account plans, when you're in your 20s and 30s, so that when you're in your 60s, you can retire. We're making long-term plans. Is that wrong? Is that okay? How should we approach it? This teaching in the modern world. And then also more specifically in terms of the shortness of our life or the temporariness of our modern lives or just lives. How does it change how we approach our life if we remember that we are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes? I think that's something also that's important to consider as Christians. So that's what we'll do for this week. Just a quick preview of the following week. We'll do James 5, 1 through 11 the following week, and we'll consider what the specific sin is of the rich in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 5, and then where do we need to show perseverance in our life? And that comes from the second half of that unit. So what's the problem with the rich people that we see in chapter 5? And then how can we kind of draw lessons from the statements about perseverance in verses 7 through 11 of chapter 5? That's for the following week, but for this week, we'll do the end of James 4 together.